I watched them drug my grandmother into silence. Not because she was violent, not because she was a danger to herself, not because any doctor had determined she needed sedation. They did it because she was black, because she was loud, because her joy and her prayers and her very presence made the white families uncomfortable. For 6 months, I watched the woman who raised me, the strongest person I've ever known, fade into a chemical fog while nurses smiled and told me it was for her own good. And when I finally discovered the truth, when I overheard a staff member say they'd increased her medications so she wouldn't bother the white families anymore, I realized that my grandmother wasn't being cared for in that nursing home. She was being erased. Her name was Dorothy Mitchell, but everyone who loved her called her Grandma. She raised 5 children by herself after my grandfather died, worked as a housekeeper for 40 years, and still found time to run the kitchen at her church every Sunday. She was the kind of woman who could walk into a room and light it up with her laugh, who knew everyone's name and everyone's business, who would pray over you whether you asked for it or not. She was loud and opinionated and completely unashamed of taking up space in a world that had spent her entire life trying to make her smaller. When she was 78, she had a stroke. Not a severe one, but enough to affect her mobility and her memory. She started forgetting things, where she'd put her keys, what day it was, sometimes what year it was. She needed help getting dressed, help bathing, help with things she'd done independently her whole life. My mother tried to care for her at home, but Mom worked full-time and Grandma needed more attention than any of us could provide while juggling jobs and kids in our own lives. That's when the social worker suggested Meadowbrook Care Center. "It's one of the nicest facilities in the area," she said, showing us glossy brochures with pictures of smiling elderly people doing crafts and playing bingo. 24-hour nursing care, activities to keep her mind engaged, beautiful grounds. And they accept Medicaid, so the cost won't be a burden on your family. She made it sound like a gift, like we'd be lucky to get Grandma a spot there. If you're here for true stories that expose how racism and neglect destroy our elders in places that are supposed to protect them, subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications right now. Because what I'm about to tell you is something that happens in nursing homes across this country every single day, and no one wants to talk about it. We toured Meadowbrook on a bright Tuesday afternoon in September. The building was clean and modern, all pale wood floors and large windows that let in natural light. The common areas were full of residents, almost all of them white, sitting in comfortable chairs, some doing puzzles, some watching television, some being led in gentle exercises by activity coordinators. The staff was professionally friendly, and the director, a white woman named Mrs. Patterson, spoke in soothing tones about their commitment to dignity and their person-centered care philosophy. I should have noticed, even then, that all the residents we saw were white. I should have asked where the black residents were, why we didn't see any during our hour-long tour. But I was young and naive and desperate to believe that this place would take care of the woman who had taken care of me my entire life. So I ignored the warning signs my gut was trying to send me, and I helped my mother sign the admission papers. Grandma moved into Meadowbrook the following week. Her room was small but clean, with a window that looked out onto the parking lot and space for a few personal items from home. We brought her favorite blanket, some family photos, and a small radio because she loved listening to gospel music. The first few days, she seemed okay, confused about why she was there, upset that she couldn't just go home, but physically fine and still herself. I visited her 3 or 4 times a week after work. In those early visits, she was still Grandma, telling me stories about her childhood in Mississippi, asking about my job and my love life, singing hymns while I helped her get ready for bed. She complained sometimes about the food being bland or about certain nurses being short with her, but I chalked it up to adjustment. It takes time to get used to a new place, I told myself. She'll settle in. But she didn't settle in. Instead, she started to disappear. It happened gradually at first. I'd visit, and she'd seem a little more tired than usual, a little slower to respond to questions. The staff said it was normal. Adjusting to a new environment was exhausting for elderly people, especially those with cognitive decline. They mentioned they'd started her on some new medications to help with anxiety and sleep, and I didn't question it. I trusted them. They were medical professionals. They knew what they were doing. By the 3rd week, Grandma was sleeping through most of my visits. I'd arrive in the evening, around 6 or 7, and find her drowsy and unfocused, struggling to keep her eyes open. When I asked the nurses about it, they said she'd had a rough day, that she'd been agitated, and they'd given her something to calm her down. She gets worked up when she's overstimulated, one nurse explained. The medication just helps her relax. But relaxed wasn't the word I would have used. Sedated, drugged. Those were the words that came to mind when I looked at my grandmother slumped in her wheelchair, her head lolling to one side, her words slurred when she tried to speak. This wasn't the woman who had raised me. This was a shell, a ghost wearing my grandmother's face. I started coming at different times, hoping to catch her during a more alert period. Sometimes it worked. If I showed up early in the morning before the day shift had given her medications, I could have brief conversations with her. She'd tell me she didn't like it there, that the nurses were mean, that they ignored her when she needed help. "They don't like me, baby," she said one morning, her words coming slow but clear. "They don't like that I talk too much, that I ask for things. They want me to just sit quiet and not make a fuss." I told her she was imagining things, that the staff was there to help her, that she needed to give them a chance. I told her the medications were helping her stay calm and get better. Even as I said it, I felt the lie sitting heavy in my chest. But I didn't know what else to do. I couldn't take her home. I couldn't provide the level of care she needed. And Meadowbrook was supposed to be one of the good places. Around the 2-month mark, I noticed something that made my stomach turn. I was walking past the activities room on my way to Grandma Dot's room when I saw a group of residents doing chair exercises, clapping along to music, laughing with each other and the staff. They were all white. All of them. And most of them looked older and frielier than my grandmother, but they were alert and engaged and clearly enjoying themselves. I found Grandma Dot in her room, alone, asleep in her bed at 2 in the afternoon. The door was closed. The lights were off. She was wearing the same clothes she'd had on 2 days earlier when I'd visited. When I gently shook her awake, she looked at me with confusion, like she didn't recognize me at first. Then her eyes cleared slightly, and she whispered, "They gave me the shot again. They always give me the shot." "What shot, Grandma?" "The one that makes me sleep. They say I'm too loud, that I'm bothering people. So they give me the shot and I sleep, and I can't wake up even when I try." I went to find a nurse. The one at the station, a young white woman whose name tag said Ashley, looked annoyed when I asked about the shot my grandmother had mentioned. "She's on a PRN protocol for agitation," Ashley said, not looking up from her computer. "When she becomes disruptive, we administer a low dose of sedative to keep her and the other residents safe." "Disruptive how? What is she doing that requires sedation?" "She calls out a lot, yells for help when she doesn't actually need anything, sings loudly and disturbs other residents, refuses to stay in her room during quiet hours. We've documented all of it. She's singing hymns. That's what she does. She's done it her whole life." Ashley finally looked at me, and I saw something in her expression that made my blood run cold. Not sympathy, not concern, just mild irritation that I was taking up her time. "I understand this is difficult," she said in that practiced, condescending tone. "But we have to think about the comfort of all our residents. Your grandmother's behaviors were creating a disruptive environment, so we adjusted her care plan accordingly. By drugging her unconscious, by managing her symptoms with appropriate medication. If you have concerns about her care plan, you're welcome to schedule a meeting with our director." I scheduled the meeting. It would be 2 weeks before Mrs. Patterson had an opening. 2 weeks during which I watched my grandmother slip further and further away, her eyes glazed, her words few, her spirit, the thing that had always made her grandma, slowly extinguished by chemicals administered by people who saw her as a problem to be managed rather than a person to be cared for. And then I overheard the conversation that changed everything. It was a Thursday evening, about 3 months into Grandma Dot's stay at Meadowbrook. I had come to visit after work, later than usual because I'd been stuck in a meeting. The halls were quieter than normal, most residents already in their rooms for the night. I was walking past the nurse's station when I heard voices coming from a small office nearby. The door was slightly ajar, and I recognized Ashley's voice immediately. "The Hendersons complained again about the noise," she was saying. "Mrs. Henderson said she could hear that black lady across the hall singing and calling out all night, and it kept her mother awake." "Dorothy?" another voice asked. I didn't recognize it. "Yeah, Dorothy Mitchell. Room 247. I already gave her an extra dose of Haldol around 8. but apparently she was still at it at midnight. The Hendersons are threatening to move their mother to another facility if we can't keep things quieter. There was a pause, then a man's voice. I thought it might be one of the night shift supervisors. Well, we can't afford to lose the Hendersons. They're private pay, full rate. Just increase Dorothy's evening meds. If she's sleeping, she can't bother anyone. Dr. Reeves already has her on a pretty high dose, Ashley said, and I could hear the hesitation in her voice. If we keep increasing it, look, the Hendersons bring in over $8,000 a month. Dorothy's on Medicaid. We get maybe a third of that. Do the math. Keep the White families happy. Keep the beds filled with people who can actually pay. If that means Dorothy sleeps more, then that's what it means. It's easier for everyone if she just stays quiet. My hands were shaking. I stood there in the hallway, frozen, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. They were sedating my grandmother not because she needed it medically, but because her presence, her black, poor, Medicaid-funded presence, was inconvenient for the white families who paid more. I wanted to burst into that office and scream at them. I wanted to grab my grandmother and run. But I was paralyzed by the sheer enormity of what I just heard, by the casual cruelty of it, by the realization that this wasn't an isolated incident or a misunderstanding. This was policy. This was how they operated. I went to Grandma Dot's room instead. She was asleep, as always, her mouth slightly open, a trail of drool on her chin. I sat beside her bed and held her hand and cried. I cried for her, for the indignity of what was being done to her. I cried for myself, for bringing her here, for trusting these people. And I cried because I didn't know how to fix this, how to protect her, how to make this right. When I finally composed myself enough to think clearly, I started taking pictures. I photographed her medication chart that was hanging on the wall outside her door. I photographed the doses and times. Haldol every 6 hours, Ativan twice daily, Seroquel at night. Doses that seemed excessive for someone who had never been diagnosed with a psychiatric condition. I photographed her care notes, which described her as combative and resistive to care, even though I had never seen her be anything but confused and drowsy. Over the next few weeks, I became obsessed with documenting everything. I kept a journal of every visit, what time I arrived, what state I found Grandma in, what the staff said, what I observed about the other residents. I started arriving at random times, early morning, late night, middle of the afternoon, to see if there were patterns to when she was more or less sedated. What I found was horrifying in its consistency. On days when I came unannounced in the early morning, before the morning medication round, Grandma was often more alert. She'd be awake, sometimes talking to herself or singing softly, and when she saw me she'd smile and reach for my hand. But by mid-morning, after the nurses had made their rounds, she'd be drowsy again, struggling to keep her eyes open, unable to hold a conversation. My journal of observations. I laid it all out on her desk, the excessive medications, the overheard conversation about keeping Grandma quiet for the Henderson family, the pattern of black residents being more heavily sedated than white ones. Mrs. Patterson listened with a practiced expression of concern that never quite reached her eyes. When I finished, she folded her hands on her desk and gave me a smile that made my skin crawl. "I appreciate you bringing your concerns to my attention," she said. "I want you to know that we take all feedback seriously, and we're committed to providing the highest quality of care to all our residents, regardless of their background or payment source." "Then why is my grandmother being drugged into unconsciousness?" "Your grandmother is receiving medications that have been prescribed by our medical director based on her behavioral needs. She has exhibited significant agitation, aggression, and resistance to care, all documented in her chart. The medications are necessary to keep her safe and to maintain a therapeutic environment for all our residents. She's not aggressive. She sings. She prays. She asks for help when she needs it. Those aren't behaviors that require antipsychotic medications." "I understand this is difficult to see," Mrs. Patterson said, her voice taking on that condescending edge I'd heard from so many of the staff. "But you're not here 24 hours a day. You don't see the behaviors that our staff sees. We have trained professionals who are with your grandmother around the clock, and they've determined that these interventions are necessary. I heard your staff say they increased her medications to keep her from bothering the white families. Are you telling me that's therapeutic? That's person-centered care?" Her expression hardened. I don't know what you think you heard, but I can assure you that medication decisions are made based on clinical need, not on the preferences of other residents' families. If you're not satisfied with the care your grandmother is receiving here, you're welcome to explore other placement options. Though I should warn you that facilities willing to accept Medicaid patients with behavioral issues are quite limited. The threat was clear. Shut up and be grateful we're taking care of her at all, or try to find somewhere else and discover that your options are even worse. I left that meeting shaking with rage and helplessness. She had stonewalled me completely, dismissed all my evidence, and made it clear that nothing would change. And she was right about one thing. My options were limited. I'd spent weeks calling other nursing homes, and most either didn't have beds available, didn't accept Medicaid, or had even worse reputations than Meadowbrook. But I couldn't leave Grandmother there. I couldn't watch them erase her 1 milligram at a time. I started recording my visits. Not video, that felt too invasive, and I knew the staff would shut it down immediately if they saw a camera. But I used my phone's voice recorder, tucked in my pocket, to capture conversations with nurses, to document the state I found Grandmother in, to preserve evidence that might matter if I ever found a way to hold these people accountable. What I captured over the next few weeks was damning. Nurses casually discussing how they'd knocked out certain residents before family visits so they wouldn't cause a scene. Staff members joking about how quiet their shift was when the loud ones are sleeping. A medication aide admitting to me that she thought Grandmother was over-medicated, but that it wasn't her place to question the doctor's orders. I also started researching. I learned about chemical restraints and how they're supposed to be used only as a last resort when someone is a danger to themselves or others, and even then with proper documentation and consent. I learned about the regulations governing nursing homes, about residents' rights, about the process for filing complaints with the state health department. And I learned that what was happening to Grandma was far from unique. Nursing homes across the country, particularly those serving low-income and minority populations, routinely used antipsychotic medications to manage difficult residents who were too vocal, too demanding, too present. It was easier and cheaper to drug people into submission than to provide adequate staffing and individualized care. The racial component was undeniable, but almost never explicitly acknowledged. Study after study showed that Black nursing home residents received worse care than white residents, were more likely to be restrained, more likely to be medicated, more likely to develop preventable complications. But the industry hid behind language about clinical judgment and behavioral needs to avoid admitting that racism and economics were driving care decisions. I brought my research to a lawyer who specialized in elder abuse cases. He looked through my documentation, listened to my recordings, and told me bluntly that while what Meadowbrook was doing was unethical and probably violated several regulations, it would be extremely difficult to prove in court. They'll argue that the medications were prescribed by a doctor based on documented behaviors, he explained. They'll produce charts full of notes about agitation and resistiveness. They'll bring in their medical director to testify that every decision was made in the best interest of the patient. And unless you can prove that they were explicitly motivated by racism, which is nearly impossible, the court will defer to their medical judgment. What about the conversation I overheard? About keeping her quiet, so she wouldn't bother the white families. Do you have a recording of it? No. I didn't think to record then. Then it's your word against theirs, and they'll deny it. I'm not saying you shouldn't fight this. I'm just being realistic about your chances of winning. The system is designed to protect facilities, not residents. Your best option might be to get your grandmother out of there and file a complaint with the state, but even that probably won't result in any meaningful consequences for Meadowbrook. It was the answer I'd expected but hoped I wouldn't get. The system that was supposed to protect vulnerable elders was instead protecting the institutions that abuse them. I decided to focus on getting Grandmother out. I contacted every nursing home within a 50-mile radius. Most had waiting lists months or years long. A few had immediate openings, but when I visited, I could see why. They were even more understaffed and depressing than Meadowbrook, warehouses for the elderly where residents sat in rows staring at nothing while a handful of overworked aides tried to manage dozens of people. Then I found an aide at Meadowbrook who was willing to help me, though she asked that I never mention her name. She was a young Black woman named Keisha who had been working there for about 6 months. She'd seen what I'd seen, and it disgusted her. They do it to all the Black residents, she told me in a whispered conversation in the parking lot. Not just your grandmother. Anyone who's loud or difficult, or who needs more care than they want to provide. They drug them until they're too out of it to complain or call for help. And on days when there are tours for potential new residents, white residents who can pay privately, they make sure to give extra doses to anyone who might make the place look bad. Can you testify to that? She shook her head. I can't afford to lose this job. I've got 2 kids and rent to pay. But I can tell you that your grandmother's care plan has notes from the director saying to minimize disruption to premium residents. That's code for keeping her quiet, so the rich white people don't complain. Premium residents, I repeated. The phrase made me want to vomit. I'm sorry, Keisha said. I wish I could do more. But if I speak up, I'll be fired and nothing will change. At least if I stay, I can try to look out for people like your grandmother when I'm on shift. I understood. She was doing what she had to do to survive in a system that punished anyone who challenged it. But I also knew that I couldn't leave Grandma out there any longer. If the system wouldn't protect her, I would have to do it myself. I talked to my mother and my aunt about bringing Grandma home. Neither of them could take on full-time caregiving. They both worked, and Grandma needed more care than they could provide on evenings and weekends. But I had been saving for a house. I had enough in the bank to cover a few months of in-home care if I was careful with expenses. We made a plan. I would move into my mother's house temporarily to save on rent. We would hire a home health aide to come during the day while Mom was at work. We would pool our resources and our time, and we would take care of Grandma ourselves the way we should have from the beginning. When I told Mrs. Patterson that I was removing my grandmother from Meadowbrook, her response was immediate and cold. If you remove her against medical advice, we cannot be held responsible for any deterioration in her condition, she said. She requires skilled nursing care and a structured environment. Taking her home could be dangerous. More dangerous than drugging her unconscious for months. I've explained to you repeatedly that her medications are medically necessary. If you choose to ignore that professional advice, the consequences are on you. I signed the discharge papers that same day. But when I went to collect Grandma, I discovered the final cruelty Meadowbrook had inflicted on her. She couldn't walk anymore. 4 months earlier, when Grandma had arrived at Meadowbrook, she could walk with a walker. Slowly, with assistance, but she could walk. Now, after months of being kept in bed or slumped in a wheelchair, after months of sedation that prevented her from moving or engaging in any physical therapy, her muscles had atrophied. She couldn't support her own weight. She couldn't stand without 2 people holding her up. This is what happens when someone is bedbound for an extended period, the physical therapist at Meadowbrook explained when I demanded to know why my grandmother could no longer walk. Muscle loss is unfortunately common in elderly patients with limited mobility. She had mobility when she came here. You took that from her by keeping her drugged. The therapist gave me a sympathetic look that felt rehearsed. We've been working with Dorothy as much as her behavioral issues allow. But when a patient is agitated or uncooperative, it's difficult to provide effective therapy. Uncooperative, agitated. Those words again, weaponized to justify every failure of care. We brought her home anyway. My brother and I lifted her from the wheelchair into my mother's car, and I watched the building that had stolen 6 months of her life disappear in the rearview mirror. Grandma was awake for the ride, more awake than I'd seen her in weeks, though still foggy and confused. She kept asking where we were going, and when I told her she was coming home, tears rolled down her face. The first week home was hell. Grandma was going through withdrawal from the medications they'd had her on. She was restless and nauseous. Her hands trembled. She couldn't sleep. The home health nurse we'd hired said it would take time for the drugs to clear her system, that we needed to be patient. But slowly, gradually, she started to come back to us. Not all the way. Some of the damage seemed permanent, the fog in her eyes never quite clearing completely, but enough that we could see glimpses of the woman she'd been. She'd smile at my mother's voice. She'd sing along, softly and off-key, when we played gospel music. She'd hold my hand and call me by name instead of staring at me with that drugged, vacant expression I'd gotten used to at Meadowbrook. The physical recovery was slower and less complete. We got her into physical therapy 3 times a week, and after months of work she regained some strength, enough to stand with assistance for short periods. But she would never walk independently again. The muscle loss and the neurological damage from the stroke, combined with months of forced immobility, had taken that from her permanently. I filed a complaint with the state health department detailing everything I'd witnessed and documented at Meadowbrook. They sent an inspector 6 weeks later. The inspector spent 4 hours at the facility, reviewed some charts, interviewed some staff, and issued a report finding no evidence of inappropriate use of chemical restraints and no violations of patient rights. The case was closed. I shouldn't have been surprised, but I was devastated. I had documentation. I had recordings. I had witness accounts from other families. And none of it mattered because the system was designed to protect facilities like Meadowbrook, not the people they abused. They clean up before inspections, Keisha told me in a text message after the inspector's visit. They bring the sedated residents out into the common areas, reduce their meds for a few days so they look more alert, coach the staff on what to say. Then as soon as the inspector leaves, everything goes back to normal. I'm sorry. I tried contacting the media. I sent my story to local news stations, newspapers, anyone I thought might care. A few reporters expressed interest initially, but when they started digging and Meadowbrook's lawyers got involved, threatening lawsuits for defamation, the stories died. No one wanted to fight a well-funded corporation with a team of attorneys over the abuse of poor elderly Black people in nursing homes. The only real consequence for Meadowbrook was that they lost one Medicaid-funded bed. One resident who wasn't bringing in much money anyway. I'm sure they filled the spot within weeks with another vulnerable elder who had nowhere else to go. Meanwhile, Grandma Dot spent her final year and a half with us at home. We made the living room into a bedroom for her, so she wouldn't have to navigate stairs. We hired aides to help with her care when we were at work. We sang with her, prayed with her, let her be as loud and present and joyful as she wanted to be. We gave her back her humanity that Meadowbrook had tried to take away. But the damage lingered. Sometimes she would drift off mid-conversation, and we wouldn't be able to bring her back for hours, her eyes distant like she was back in that fog. Sometimes she would wake up at night crying, saying people were trying to give her shots, begging us not to let them make her sleep. The trauma of what had been done to her didn't fade, just because she was safe now. And she wasn't the same. Parts of her personality that had been so vibrant before Meadowbrook, her quick wit, her memory for stories, her ability to quote scripture, were dulled or gone entirely. We'd gotten her back, but not all of her. The medications and the months of neglect had taken pieces of her that we would never recover. One afternoon about a year after we'd brought her home, I was sitting with her while she dozed in her recliner. The home health aide had just left, and it was just the two of us in the quiet house. Grandma had opened her eyes and looked at me with unusual clarity. "They tried to make me disappear," she said. "Who did, Grandma?" "Those people at that place. They didn't like that I was loud. Didn't like that I sang and prayed and asked for things. So they gave me medicine to make me quiet, to make me not be there anymore. I know. I'm so sorry I didn't get you out sooner. It's not your fault, baby." She reached for my hand with fingers that still trembled slightly. They've been making Black women disappear for a long time. In different ways, but it's always the same. We're too loud, too much, too something. So they find ways to silence us. She closed her eyes again and drifted back to sleep, but her words stayed with me. This wasn't just about one nursing home or one grandmother. It was about a system that had been silencing and erasing Black women for generations, and nursing homes were just the latest tool for doing it. Grandma died 18 months after we brought her home. Peacefully, in her sleep, in the house where she was loved and valued and allowed to take up all the space she wanted. At her funeral, the church was packed with people whose lives she'd touched, and the singing and the praise were loud enough to shake the walls. Everything she'd been denied at Meadowbrook, she got in those final months at home. But I still wake up some nights thinking about the 6 months she spent in that place. 6 months stolen from her, from us. 6 months she spent in a chemical fog because her very existence was inconvenient for the white families who paid more. And I think about all the other Grandma Dots still in places like Meadowbrook, still being drugged into silence, still being made invisible, still suffering because no one with power considers them worth protecting. It's been 3 years since Grandma Dot died. 3 years since I buried the woman who raised me, knowing that the last year and a half of her life were good ones, but that they were also years spent recovering from abuse that never should have happened. 3 years of carrying the guilt of having trusted a system that saw my grandmother as a problem to be managed rather than a person deserving of dignity. I've spent those 3 years trying to make something meaningful out of what happened to her. I volunteer with elder advocacy groups now. I speak at community centers about warning signs of nursing home abuse. I help other families document concerns about their loved ones' care and navigate the complaint process, even though I know from experience that most complaints go nowhere. I've learned that what happened to Grandma is devastatingly common. Across the country, nursing homes disproportionately use chemical restraints on Black residents, on poor residents, on residents whose families don't have the resources or the knowledge to fight back. The industry calls it managing behaviors or ensuring safety, but the reality is that it's easier and cheaper to drug people into submission than to hire adequate staff or provide person-centered care. The data is clear if you know where to look. Black nursing home residents are more likely than white residents to receive antipsychotic medications without a psychiatric diagnosis. They're more likely to be physically restrained. They're more likely to develop preventable complications like bed sores and infections. They're more likely to die prematurely. And all of this is explained away as comorbidities or clinical judgment rather than acknowledged as the systemic racism and neglect that it is. I think about the conversation I overheard at Meadowbrook constantly. The casual cruelty of it. Keep the white families happy. If that means Dorothy sleeps more, then that's what it means. Those words haunt me because they reveal a truth that the nursing home industry doesn't want to admit, that in a profit-driven system, some lives are valued more than others, and the lives least valued are those of poor elderly people of color. Meadowbrook is still operating, still accepting residents, still maintaining its reputation as a nice facility in the community. I drive past it sometimes and feel sick thinking about who might be in there right now, drugged into silence so they won't disturb the comfort of families who can afford to pay more. I tried one more time to get justice, about a year after Grandma died. I contacted a civil rights organization that takes on cases of racial discrimination in healthcare. They were interested initially, but when they learned that Grandma had passed away and that I had no concrete proof that race was the explicit motivation for her treatment, just the overheard conversation I hadn't recorded, they told me the case would be too difficult to win. "We believe you," the attorney said, "and we know this is happening. But without recorded evidence of explicitly racist statements, and without a living plaintiff who can testify, we can't build a strong enough case. The facility will hide behind medical documentation and clinical judgment, and the court will defer to that." So Meadowbrook faced no consequences. The staff who decided that my grandmother's presence was too disruptive for the white families faced no consequences. Mrs. Patterson, who made it clear that Medicaid residents were worth less than private pay residents, faced no consequences. The system protected them all. But I can tell the story. I can make sure that people know what happens in places that are supposed to be providing care to our most vulnerable elders. I can warn other families to be vigilant, to ask questions, to trust their instincts when something feels wrong. Because if I'd trusted my instincts sooner, if I'd acted the first time I felt uneasy about how sedated Grandma was, maybe I could have gotten her out before so much damage was done. The guilt of that will stay with me forever. I chose to trust the system instead of trusting my own eyes. I chose to believe the professionals instead of believing my grandmother when she said they didn't like her, that they wanted her to be quiet. I failed her, and I have to live with that. But I also know that the system is designed to make families feel that way, to make us doubt ourselves, to make us defer to medical expertise, to make us feel guilty for questioning care decisions. That's how they maintain power. That's how they continue to abuse vulnerable people while hiding behind the language of professionalism and clinical judgment. Subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications for more true stories that expose the racism and abuse our elders face in nursing homes across this country. And if you've ever had a loved one in a care facility who was over-medicated, silenced, or made invisible, drop a heart in the comments. You're not alone. What happened to your family member was real, and it wasn't right, and you deserve to be heard. I share Grandma Dot's story not because I think it will bring about massive systemic change. I'm too cynical now to believe that. But I share it because somewhere, someone might read this or hear this and recognize what's happening to their own loved one before it's too late. Someone might find the courage to question excessive sedation, to demand answers, to remove their family member from a facility that's harming them. And I share it because Grandma deserves to be remembered not just for how she died, but for who she was before Meadowbrook tried to erase her. She was a woman who sang loud, prayed loud, loved loud. She was a woman who took up space unapologetically in a world that had spent her entire life trying to make her smaller. She was a woman who raised 5 children alone, worked her fingers to the bone for 60 years, and still had enough joy and strength left over to help raise her grandchildren and feed half the neighborhood. She was not a problem to be managed. She was not a disruption to be silenced. She was a human being who deserved dignity and respect and care that saw her as a person, not as a Medicaid payment. They tried to make her disappear, but I won't let them. I'll keep telling her story for as long as I have breath. And maybe, just maybe, it will make a difference for someone else's grandmother who's being drugged into silence right now in a facility just like Meadowbrook. Because that's all I can do. Tell the truth. Bear witness. Make sure that Grandma Dot's name and her story and her beautiful, loud, unapologetic life aren't forgotten. Rest in power, Dorothy Mitchell. You deserved so much better than what they did to you. But you also got to go home, to be loved, to be yourself again before the end. And I'm grateful for every loud, joyful, difficult, precious moment of that time. They try to silence you, but I'm still here, and I'm going to be as loud as you taught me to be.